SOC commitment or my anti-SOC commitment. So far, I'm holding the line. And we've had a variety in this series, which I think is a quite remarkable series that I'm sure since you're here among the plenitude of the Great Plains, it might not be apparent what a remarkable thing this series is. I would feel quite fortunate to have such a thing at my home university, and I know you've had an extraordinary series of interesting, nuanced, and sophisticated visitors. I want to promise that tonight's talk is not going to be nuanced or sophisticated in any regard. It's going to involve a certain amount of somewhat recalcitrant economics, but it means to be entirely practical, and it needs to turn in that direction toward the end. The presentation has 3 sections and 3 registers. Each section does something with crisis theory, which is an approach to understanding systemic capitalist crisis, not via reciting Marx's own incomplete theory, but by applying to the actually existing economy the analytic tools he has made available. The 3 registers are theory, example, speculation. The sections themselves are therefore a summary of crisis theory, an example of its application to a notable feature of our present political situation, and then a brief final turn toward what we might expect of the near future, a discussion which may be relegated to the Q&A for the sake of time in this. But I first want to spend just a moment addressing the question in the title, whether crisis theory, which arises from the critique of political economy and involves a bit of math and a bit more of economic thought, might itself be discovered under the umbrella of critical theory. Now, in some obvious sense, the answer to this question must be no, and that's okay. There are a variety of critical theories associated with post-structuralism, for the most part, have made claims on materialism, often via claims about the materiality of language. These theories have not proved particularly adequate to grasping crisis, economic crisis, most obviously. Moreover, these discourse-centered theories, ascending rather precisely in the era organized by the power of finance capital, have often staked themselves on the exaltation of discourse as itself a productive force. This thought corresponds to some of the more unsavory rhetorics of finance. Franco Berardi's cool-sounding term semio-capital says it all, wherein the play of signifiers purportedly becomes a source of value. It is the belief of investors, a mental condition coordinated by language and subjectivity, that generates the value of financial instruments. This increasing value equals more belief, equals more investors, equals even more value in a self-referential circuit. Money, detached from any material limit, simply becomes more money through a series of discursive operations without ever passing through the moment of appropriation, of exploitation of me and you and all our friends and several billion strangers. Crisis theory has a rather different story to tell about the sequence and why it ends. A self-evident fact that theories of discursive production cannot explain. At the same time, precisely because it centers itself not in discourse, but in value and price, in the circuit of production and circulation and other categories of Marx's critique, crisis theory cannot provide a mode of reading, a textual apparatus. In this sense, too, it seems alien to much of critical theory, notably in its home counties within the humanities departments of universities. It is not altogether clear what it might mean for a graduate student to have a crisis-theoretical method for reading the recent poems of Juliana Spar, the later films of the Fast and Furious cycle, the speeches of Barack Obama, beyond the narrowly historical thought that these things arise within a context of global economic crisis, and so, are probably dealing with it somehow, in some inverted way, not at first evident. Even there, you'll notice I had to slip into ideology critique, which is not the same thing as crisis theory, though it's probably the closest genetic kin within the canonical theory proper. And yet, actually I have a joke that the second paragraph of every essay has to start "and yet," So you're always sort of checking yourself. So I'm running a little late already. And yet, if one were to understand critical theory as a ruthless critique of all that exists, a theory which discovers in the internal logic of the present mode of social existence an irresolvable inconsistency, the very inaccessibility of which structures our ability to register, grasp, and engage our real conditions, well, in that case, crisis theory and critical theory are one. At least, the critical theory that interests me. They are systematic criticisms constructed not from an external position positing some model of ethics or rights or justice, but from the world as it is, doing whatever work is necessary to make that world stand before us. But it is not just a matter of making apparent. For me, the measure of an analysis is that it tells you where to intervene. And when I say intervene, I mean act to abolish currently existing conditions. These are the stakes of crisis theory. So let me now turn to an all too swift summary, to making a reading via crisis theory that contemplates what many have called the return of the riot, and then offer one or two speculations on the ongoing dynamic of crisis and political struggle, the conversation I hope might continue after the talk is complete. Crisis theory is a theory within which the tendency of the capitalist economy towards systemic crisis is understood as internal to the character of capital itself, rather than the result of external shocks, such as new technologies, bad harvests, political turmoil, resource depletion, sunspots, or the various other explanations that have been offered in the last 200 years. The economic thought, which functions as an endless apologia for the way things are, whose mantra is always, there is no alternative, insists that capitalism works fine, that it knows only temporary failures caused by arbitrary and external factors. For all that, capitalism in its fully elaborated form has so far lasted about 2 centuries, not terribly long, and endured 4 massive global crises. The original Great Depression of 1872 to 95, 1929 to the Second World War, 1973 and 2008, the crisis in which we still find ourselves. Now, I should say here, as a small but incalculably important note, that the model of crisis theory I'm presenting does not contemplate ecological crisis, but in no way means to diminish the significance of that catastrophe. I should also say that even within our framework, there are several subgenres of crisis. I'm going to offer the most rigorous one, which is known as the crisis of accumulation. I'm going to try to fit a 6 weeks course into about 12 minutes. I've had some practice, but it'll be breakneck and incomplete, like crisis itself. And I'll try to render the theory as a narrative, using a less technical language than I would if I were an economist intent on baffling and demoralizing you. A couple of terms do need to be clarified, others we'll deal with as they come up. The exchange of goods is not capitalism, even if you use money. If you start with a sweater and exchange it for money and exchange that for a kilt, you are not capitalist. That's just simple exchange. Commodity, money, commodity. CMC. Capitalism is distinguished by the formula MCM. The capitalist starts with money and deals in sweaters only toward ending up with money again. If one starts with money, moreover, there is no interest in ending up with the same amount, in exchanging a lump of money for the same sized lump. So the full formula for capital, as opposed to simple exchange, is MCM prime, money, commodity, more money. Capital is value in expansion. It must grow or die. The cycle MCM prime features 2 distinct moments, MC and CM, which correspond to the 2 great spheres of capital, production and circulation. They overlap at the commodity. The commodity is valorized in the production process by the application of living labor to production materials. The value it bears must then be realized in the form of price in the sphere of circulation. where the commodity is sold and either consumed or sold on. The value soaked up by the commodity in production is greater than the value expended by the capitalist in the process, for the simple reason that living labor, the worker, has a unique characteristic. The capitalist buys two kinds of commodities in the production process: means of production like yarns and spindles, and then the labor of workers. From these, the consumer good, the sweater, is produced. Now, $100 in yarn is just that. There's no way it can transfer more than $100 in value to the sweaters. A worker, on the other hand, that's you, need not be paid the amount he or she transfers to the commodity. He or she need only be paid enough to replace her or his expended labor power, enough and no more than to bring the worker back to work the next day. This difference enters the commodity as surplus value, which is then realized in circulation as profit. Okay, that will be basic material for many of you. I want to offer one more useful clarification, a basic but decisive and often neglected distinction between accumulation and profit. Simple profit is when one actor ends up with more money than when they began. Accumulation is when new value is added to the capitalist system as a whole, so the total amount of capital expands. I'm going to demonstrate this with a very quick game, which involves me and Marco and Roland. So let's say each of us has $100 and 100 widgets. And I sell 10 widgets to Roland for $10. And he turns around and sells his 10 widgets to Marco for $20. So now I have $110 and 90 widgets. I'm about even. Marco, you see, has done quite poorly in this deal and has only $80 for his 110 widgets, whereas Roland, who turns out to be very clever in this exchange, has his original 100 widgets but $110. He's indeed made a substantial profit. Marco's made a loss. I'm even. I'm not saying this would really happen in reality. I suspect Marco would do very well. But you can see in that it's quite easy to make profit with there being no increase in the system itself, right? There's still the same 300 widgets, the same $300. There's been no accumulation, just profit. So we want to be very clear about the difference between those two categories. That's a zero-sum game, and you'll notice it's a circulation game. That's just about the moving around of revenues and goods. There's no moment of production within that game whatsoever. Without production, there's no accumulation. Capital is defined by accumulation. It cannot survive simply by buying cheap and selling dear, by the zero-sum strategies I just demonstrated. MCM prime must apply to the whole system. Now, there's actually a huge amount of work that's necessary for life and capitalism to go on, but that doesn't generate accumulation. Marx uses the technical term productive labor for a subset of work. It happens in the sphere of production, in the relationship between capital and labor, mediated by the wage and the commodity, and because of this, is able to produce value where there was none. That's all productive means. It's in no way an ethical category. It doesn't indicate necessity. It's just what produces new value for the system. In the circulation game we just played, we never asked who made the widgets, in what conditions, but that was where the value came from in the first place. None of our work was productive, no surplus value was generated. We were just reapportioning revenues. So all accumulation features profit, but it's entirely possible to have a lot of profit without any accumulation, which is a huge problem for capital. Now, how does this happen? Well, among the many contradictions of capital, one in particular orients crisis theory. On the one hand, capital as a whole can only accumulate by exploiting these workers in the production process. On the other hand, as individual capitals compete against each other, they're not thinking about systemic accumulation. They don't really care. They're concerned only with their own profit. They're driven by the singular compulsion, which is to be more productive than their competitors. If Marco's sweater source can develop a more productive process than Roland's atelier of sweaters, a more efficient process which allows fewer workers to crank out more sweaters in fewer hours, which is all productivity means, He can then undercut Rowland, get a larger market share, and clear a larger profit. For a while, until Rowland invests in this wondrous new sweater-making technology, casts a few workers out into the street, and off they go. More machines, less labor time. In fact, Rowland's sweaterator is new and improved, so now he can lose even more workers than Marco did, lower his sweater prices even further, while his profits rise temporarily before, alas, I enter the market with Sweaterator 3 that requires almost no living labor at all. But that living labor is where the new value was coming from. Well, what the hell do I care? I'm making a profit. So it's pretty good for me, but it's not going to work for capital as a whole. This is what Marx calls the moving contradiction. Capital itself is the moving contradiction. In general, I can actually put up passages and not read them as a way of saving time, but this one is worth reading. Capital itself is the moving contradiction because it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum while it posits labor time on the other side as the sole measure of wealth. Capital is compelled, that is to say, to eliminate the very grounds for its existence as capital. The development of this contradiction, the increasing ratio of machines and inputs, which we call constant capital, or C, to living labor, which we call variable capital, or V, is measured in the categories of technical and organic composition of capital. Now I'm going to put up the proper definitions so as to be a proper scholar, but there's no need to get lost in them right now. I think we have a handle on the concept and can go back to the narrative. So, what happens next? As profitability inevitably declines in the sweater sector, nobody will invest there. Owners of capital only invest with the expectation of a decent return. So, capital moves to the kilt sector, and the drama repeats. The investment in the Kiltomatic, the Kiltomatic 2, and then the Kiltastic ultimate kilt maker, advanced automation, diminishing trend in profits, and we can see this is bound to happen in every line, in every sector, because nobody has a choice. We capitalists, we have to increase productivity or we cease to be capitalists. We get put out of business. So now we have an accumulation of goods, of kilts and sweaters, an accumulation of productive capacity, an accumulation of capital that no one will invest, because why would you? In capitalism, the only reason you set your money in motion is to turn it into more money. If the profit rate is too low, you just hold it, because it's the most flexible of all commodities. In short, unused labor piles up next to unused factories, while banks sit on unused capital. That's a crisis. It's worth insisting before continuing that it's a crisis for capital. Capital has suddenly discovered it's really hard to reproduce itself. Well, everyone else, the workers, the unemployed, the surplus population, they already know this. They already wake up every day facing this terrifying compulsion to reproduce themselves. And the only way to do this is to help capital reproduce itself. They are compelled to reproduce the very thing which dominates them, which compels them, which exploits them. This is what it means to be not capital, even when capital is humming along. For those without reserves, it's always a crisis. Now, I want to retell the story of crisis slightly differently, to clarify the status of finance. It turns out that our historical experience of declining industry and rising finance is neither unique nor new. Every master of the capitalist world system since the 14th century has gone through this cycle, wherein they start as a merchant nation, rise to dominance through industrial expansion, and drive profitability down, at which point the nation, now an empire, unable to accumulate, turns to finance and various other zero-sum profit-taking schemes, staggers through a period of volatility, even as a new imperial power rises to replace it. Here's the greatest chart of global crisis in history, showing the interlocking transfer of global power from the Italian city-states to the United Republics of Holland, to the British Empire, to the US Empire. Each one suffering first a signal, and then a terminal crisis, between which finance reigns and circulation dominates over production, without fail, a sign of autumn for the empire. Systemic crisis means transformation of the capitalist world system. This is where we find ourselves. Now, having set forth a history of crisis, I want to turn to a feature of the current global situation which has received considerable notice. The return of the riot, and indeed the description of our period as the age of riots, has been much discussed. There are many kinds of riots historically: bread riots, and race riots, sports riots, eviction riots. There's no shortage of special cases and exceptions. For present purposes, however, age of riots designates, on the one hand, the riots moving steadily toward the core of the US-centered world system, such as those in Greece, France, Spain, and the United Kingdom, and now rising in the United States. And on the other, riots that approach the status of revolution, as those still passing through the Maghreb and Mashreq. That we are in an age of riots is an assessment shared by, for example, the New England Complex Systems Institute and the political philosopher Alain Badiou. Their influential new studies represent two methodological poles of what we might call riot studies. The former prefers a positivistic quantitative science, a single bullet correlation wherein the authors identify a specific food price threshold above which protests become likely, as they say in the delicate language of science. The latter offers an abstracted qualitative sense of the political moment. Badiou identifies intervallic periods between political sequences which, lacking an organizing idea, host the disordered proto-political mode of riot. Now, both of these methods are portable. Each extends itself, for example, to the European situation in the earlier 19th century. For the complex systems team, it is a matter of widespread droughts preceding the volatility of 1848. Badiou sees an uncanny resemblance between the political interregnum of our age and the French Restoration following the final defeat of the Republican spirit. E.P. Thompson, in his remarkable essay, The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th Century, locates this previous riot-charged age somewhat earlier, tracing the sequence that begins in 1709 and becomes a regular feature after mid-century with a periodicity strikingly similar to the modern business cycle. Thompson's national focus provides a somewhat different periodization of riot than the French examples above, and for us a more useful one as it unfolds within not just the horizons, but the heart of the capitalist world system, that moving center schematized earlier as a history of imperial cycles to which we will return. Thompson, writing before either, is skeptical of both our models of riot studies. He offers no sympathy for the growth historians who, from a price-driven determinism, derive a spasmodic account of riot, wherein the participants are in no regard as historical actors. These historians are found, quote, guilty of the crass economic reductionism, obliterating the complexities of motive, behavior, and function, which, if they noted it in the work of their Marxist analogs, would make them protest. Against this admonition, Thompson does not yield to the explanatory power of the political, a la Badiou. That's the extent of my French. He offers instead a periodization according to the systemic transition, to wit, the passage of the Industrial Revolution. If in advance of this shift the market has generalized itself as a social fact, the modern wage relation has not yet done so. This will require the ascent of the factory and the mine against agricultural labor. Consequently, per Thompson, social struggle in the earlier period takes the form of interventions in the marketplace, wherein merchants and hoarders are persuaded to reconsider their policies at peril of destruction. Now, two features of these events are particularly worth remarking for their bearing on later developments. One is the subspecies of eruption called by Thompson the export riot, seemingly geographical. 1795 and 1800, he writes, well, you have the quote up there. The other feature is an extensive participation of manual workers, but if such laborers were prominent, one cannot help but note it was not as laborers. This is precisely the situation that will turn with the century. Economic class conflict in 19th century England, Thompson writes, found its characteristic expression in the matter of wages. Once the wage relation is generalized, such struggle no longer seeks to set the price, in his terms, of provisions, but rather to set the price of labor power. Action moves from the market to factory and mine. Historian R.H. Tawney writes, the economy of the medieval borough was one in which consumption held somewhat the same primacy in the public mind as the undisputed arbiter of economic effort as the 19th century attached to profits. The same shift occurs in Western Europe. It is deferred, but not by much. Shorter and Tilly, in their study of the French strike, begin with a document from 1830 that captures in flight the same change detailed in Thompson. Our deputy in Douai is able to register neither the political valence of this event nor the change it announces. These two misrecognitions are one. It is exactly because an intervention with the paymaster takes the form of a marketplace melee that its content cannot be recognized. We might suggest he has the mind of the 18th century trailing the great change, but the presumption that crowd violence must not be properly political is itself a constant feature of riot studies, persisting to this day. In Thompson's words, we have been able to accept for so long an abbreviated and economistic picture of the food riot as a direct, spasmodic, irrational response to hunger, a picture which is itself a product of political economy, which diminished human reciprocities to the wage nexus. This is one of the limits against which Thompson's account presses. It is not the birth of a certain political antagonism of which he seeks to take the measure, but its qualitative transformation. Riot yields pride of place to strike and to new forms of organization. The essay moves to capture the grain and texture of periodization itself. We are coming to the end of one tradition, and the new tradition has scarcely emerged. For all the clarity of Thompson's account, its eloquent synthesis of local facts and systemic transformations, it confronts an evident problem. It offers what is essentially a single point across which periods break: goods to wages, agriculture to industry, market to factory, riot to strike. It stands mute in the face of later changes. And what can this tell us of our own present moment to help us navigate between the Scylla of positivism and the Charybdis of political idealism? It is here that the framework of world systems theory of long centuries and systemic cycles of circulation might let that earlier moment speak to our own. So let me bring back the schema we glanced at earlier, now to focus on the period in modern capitalism, post-industrial revolution. Britain's long 19th century follows the tripartite schema common to all cycles of accumulation. 2 periods of financial expansion, bracketing a central period of material expansion. These can also be understood as periods dominated in series by merchant, industrial, and financial capital. In either description, only the middle and longest phase is value productive, leading to actual accumulation on a world scale. The transition from riot form to strike form that Thompson draws forth at the dawn of the 19th century is indeed the same fact as the generalization of direct wage labor, which in turn is the same fact as the rising cry of the Industrial Revolution and Britain's phase of material expansion, which is to say, finally, its phase of value accumulation. Let us now leave the hidden abode of history for the noisy sphere of the present. Obviously, we will not find a sea change equivalent to that from nascent to realized capitalism. Our moment does, nonetheless, admit of a lesser but still significant transformation, indeed a vast transformation, also a sea change of a sort, the decline of the United States-centered cycle of accumulation, opening onto a next movement of a sort yet to clarify itself. Suddenly, we realize that we have been tracking crisis theory all along. Origi's chart marks the shift from the second industrial phase to the third financial phase right around 1973. It looks like this. What we're seeing is a catastrophic collapse of manufacturing profitability for the leading industrial nations, such that the best year after 1973 is, as a general rule, worse than the worst year from the period of the long post-war boom. Indeed, we might want to argue that the 1973 and present crises form a unity, an initial crisis in production from which the economy never truly recovers, papering it over with nominal profits that evaporate in one bust after another, with the big bust coming in 2008. At that moment, employment in the US drops to 59%, total population, total employed, and despite increasingly implausible claims about recovery, it remains there to this day. Real accumulation rests below 2%, well under the historical rate adequate for capital's need to expand. Now, once we see this, we can navigate between our two poles of riot studies, but historical materialism should not be understood simply to replace or reject such approaches. Rather, it offers a mediation between seemingly incommensurate methods. That use intervallic periods may not be understood as periods of transition between phases within any given cycle of accumulation. If they are characterized by the absence of a political idea that might magnetize masses, they are equally identified as seismic shifts in the rate of real accumulation. Once we have attuned said intervals with empirical data, said data may then become not a blind set of correlations, as in the New England Institute's method, but an opportunity to ground accounts of a political moment beyond the airy confines of the idea. Now, this raises the immediate question of whether there is a meaningful relation between, say, global manufacturing data and that food price index so beloved by the New England Institute. If we are indeed to grasp historically the return of the riot via the former, when it tracks to the latter so persuasively. Happily, these data keep close company. They're close to being the same fact. But that one is far more capacious in its comprehension of capital's systemic situation and direction. I would suggest that if we wish to move beyond pure correlation in grasping the sense and incipience of riots, we would do better to look at things like the PMI, or even at planned capital expenditures, a forward-looking index usefully suggestive regarding the sector or sphere toward which capital's center of gravity is leaning. And in this case, just as crisis theory predicts, indicating overaccumulation of fixed capital and the shift away from production, we can now situate the phenomenon of food price datum and Badiou's abstract ideas within a concretely unfolding historical dynamic. So, when production is working, strikes work. When not, not. When profit's mainspring is exploitation of productive labor, it is there that struggle will erupt. When real growth is high, labor has more to gain, capital more to lose. Moreover, in these central periods of material expansion, there is a sort of social surplus, which on the one hand lets labor, stocked with war chests and stable communities, organize strikes. And on the other, lets capital purchase social peace. A signal crisis indicates the end of this period, and thus of the dominance of this form of struggle. Moreover, the new modes of labor and profit disaggregate masses of workers both spatially and temporally. If there is an age of riots, it is not the consequence of a changing mood, a lack of discipline, an increase in dissatisfaction, the failure of some organizational ideal to be put forward. It is that the way people struggle arises from a concrete set of developments, features of a global and local political economy. Crisis means riots. But it means this for a reason, which a critique of political economy can make clear. Riots are not a mistake, and they are not irrational. They are the form of struggle proper to a given situation. Rather than defining them by a given activity, picket lines and downing of tools on one side, violence and mayhem on the other, we want to understand the distinction as one between struggles in the workplace, particularly in the productive sector, versus struggles in the marketplace. That is, production versus circulation. Participants may be, at the moment, employed or unemployed, but this is not the decisive factor. It is rather to intervene as labor or as the dispossessed. These include such famous disorders as arson and looting, of which I strongly approve for reasons I'm happy to clarify. But the riot, understood in these terms, also includes the blockade and the occupation. Strikes are production struggles. Riots are circulation struggles. Crisis theory tells us with extraordinary clarity, riots are coming. They're already here. This failure of value accumulation is the same fact as the end of the industrial phase of material expansion, which in turn indicates the decline of productive wage labor as the pivot of capital's profitability. In such a crisis, capital has a limited number of moves to make. With less and less surplus value to be gotten from production, the struggle for profit necessarily shifts to circulation. In a desperate effort to turn over the excess of commodities more swiftly and more efficiently, even if each bears less value. We're in a CM moment, that is to say, sometimes obvious, sometimes disguised. In such a situation, we would expect to see a massive build-out of the global circulatory system and a credit-fueled acceleration of turnover. This is precisely what has come to pass with containerization and the super-automation of ports, and with finance and the shift of what labor there is to circulatory labors like call centers and modes of flow management toward a planetary network of logistics and supply chains. Even China, contrary to received wisdom, is now shedding jobs in industrial production. Meanwhile, Chinese national companies just purchased the majority control over the main port in Greece and are building accompanying railroads and logistics centers. Circulation is where the intercapitalist struggle has gone to die if it doesn't kill everything else first. Just as the markets yielded pride of place to the workplace as a site of struggle at the dawn of the 19th century, this action now reverses itself, but at an expanded scale. The world market becomes, again, a place of struggle. Here's Thompson one last time. The implications of this argument for the present are clear enough. The eclipse of the workers' movement and of the kinds of organizational programs which arose from them, from labor union to party politics to Lenin-inspired socialist struggles, is a real fact, not an ideological phantasm. Material conditions, the restructurations of capital, have taken such programmatic visions off the table, no matter how many times neo-Leninists enthuse about organization and the party. In one of Aesop's fables, a man who had been off in foreign lands returns home and brags of his exploits. He claims that in Rhodes, he took a great leap. Its equal had never been seen. To which the listening skeptic replies, "Hic Rhodus, hic salta." Here is Rhodes, jump here. An early version of show me the money. What then? We can expect to see greater struggles in circulation in the world marketplace as capital comes ever more urgently to depend on its smooth global functioning. The export riot of 1795 will return. Indeed, it already has. One need only consider that the broadest US strike of the crisis so far, which one might think would offer a counter-argument, has been entirely in the circulation sphere. Walmart, currently the world's largest publicly traded corporation, which is effectively a series of inland ports that distribute without producing. Predictably enough, This strike became an occasion for riot cops, the all too familiar figure of the last few years of struggle. Having moved through the analysis in full, we can also not be surprised at the dramatic action around ports themselves at a global scale, and even in the US, where the Oakland port shutdown of November 2011 was the largest directly antagonistic political action of the crisis to this point. In some ways, this speculation regarding immediate struggle will seem pessimistic news for those whose historical model of radical politics and organizing and their vision of communism is in fact a Labor Party-based socialism. This must be okay. The task of theory is not to discover solutions we like, not to search for car keys under the streetlight, but to understand the inner movement of the real situation. Only then can theory move beyond wishful thinking and provide an analysis that tells us where to intervene. But I think the proposition of circulation struggles is perhaps far more open and available than our habits of thought might first suggest, especially if we understand communism not to be the state control of capitalist production, but the destruction of capital's social relations, the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The power of circulation struggles lies precisely in their roots in crisis, in the production of surplus population. This is what is meant when those who lack any future within the unfolding of capitalism declare, "We are the crisis." Circulation struggles open up the possibilities of systemic antagonism, not just for those with access to the levers of production, but to all of those dispossessed and immiserated by capital. We are, many of us, excluded from the place of production. We are, all of us, within the space of flows, the ceaseless cascading motion of global circulation in which capital ever more desperately depends. Here's Rhodes. Fight here. Thank you very much.
Obviously, we have plenty of time now for questions, so please go ahead.
You know, it seems both sort of somewhat of a narrow frame of history and also in terms of sort of world geography. I wonder if the real action isn't the count. You know, there's all these online fights between the anarchists and the communists about who's got the proper solution. You know, a party or not have a party. And certainly there's some TV spectacle, you know, to the riots. But I wonder if the real action in some sense isn't in what we're calling failed states. That the real present, you know, never been modern alternative to capitalism, and probably where we're headed is, you know, tribalism, warlords, piracy. You know, certainly as long as there are people that in some sense buy into the idea that they can have a place at the table of capitalism, there'll be riots. But I wonder if the broader movement in some sense isn't towards something like a failed state.
In some ways, that's certainly true, which is to say, as long as one's orientation is toward a certain mode of the political, in which the question of the state is the fundamental question, ways we understood the state to operate for quite a long time, but certainly in the modern sense, since the rise of the European state nations in the 19th century, you know, they'll probably stop existing in that form, and that will be registerable as a failed state. I think if one's orientation is not toward the state, but toward political economy and toward that sort of mode of the production of social life, that may turn out to be a less significant question. I mean, I think the real question is going to be how humans can reproduce themselves in society outside of the capitalist structure, right? How they can produce the means to live and have a common social life, which is not organized around this structure of exploitation and isolation. What that looks like politically is an open question, but I don't think it's a political measure. For me, the political is secondary to that.
I guess I was just suggesting we're seeing it in all over, you know, in parts of Africa and now increasingly in the Middle East. We're seeing the alternative to how people will live without of sort of a formal state, and in some sense then without internally with capitalism, these sort of a tribalistic warlords.
We're seeing a certain thing, right? But I'm not sure what we're seeing there is the failure of capitalism. We're seeing something internal to capitalism. If I thought that Somalia, and obviously, like any sensible person, I'm strongly pro-pirate. But if I thought that Somalia was entering into an actual non-capitalist state where people were making their lives outside of capitalism, outside the need of either direct or indirect market access, I would be very interested in that. And like calling that a failed state, that's just a normative measure of what states are, right? So my question for me is not how it measures up to some standard of what a state is. My question for me is whether people find a way to reproduce their lives that doesn't involve that particular social relation that's called capitalism. And I don't think that's happening in Somalia. So it may be a failed state, but it's not failed capitalism, except in the way that capitalism is an endless failure for the individuals who are subject to it. Like, I just think that this involves a register shift in the end between the question of what a state is and the question of what actual social relations are. States, as we understand them currently, are designed to adequately and successfully manage capital, right? That's what they do. And so what we're seeing is a failure to manage capital adequately there, but that's not the end of capitalism at all. And I worry that if we take the sort of rhetoric you're proposing, it ends up just being an alibi for capitalism, which is to go like, listen, I know you hate capitalism, and perhaps in an abstract way, I know that people, the 10 million people living in Dhaka without any access to the wage whatsoever really hate capitalism. But it could be a lot worse. It could be a failed state. And I really worry about that line of alibi, right, which provides, like, we should all desperately cling to this diminishing, increasingly immiserating mode of life because anything else is worse. That's just that Winston Churchill position, you know, which I don't find very persuasive. Yes, hi.
Hi.
You're the most elegant. That was good.
Thank you.
So.
Coming right after that. So I was wondering, you were going to say a little bit about your approval of riots and arson and
Looting in particular.
Yeah. And you know, I'm thinking about this because I have friends who are in Nanterre, where the riots took place a few years ago, and a friend of mine, lost her vehicle, and it was a very stressful time to be living in Nanterre. When it's not a stressful time.
This is the 2005 riots?
Yeah. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your attitude towards riots and looting and why.
Yeah.
What up with that?
Well, there's two ways for me to go with this question. There's like the extremely unapologetic way, which goes, listen, cars are going to burn. And that seems like a super fair thing to say, right? Which is to say, as far as I recall, I've never burned a car. But it's clear to me that in the transition from a capitalist system to a non-capitalist system, should it happen in our lifetimes or the next, cars are going to burn. And if we want to pretend that there can be some magical transformation of that social order, which will free 6 billion people from exploitation, I don't think it does us very well to pretend that's going to happen because unicorns come down and twinkle their noses and something else, something happens. It's going to be a serious struggle, and far more than cars are going to burn. Now that said, it's actually looting within contemporary riots that I'm most interested in. Obviously looting is in some sense extremely limited. If the struggle, as I was suggesting before, is for people to figure out how to reproduce themselves without mediation through the wage and through exploitation, looting is a very short-term solution, right? It's not production. You take all the Special K from Walgreens and you eat it, and it lasts you for a couple of weeks, and then you're like, the looting really reaches its limits. So we shouldn't imagine it's any solution. But it points at the solution, right? For me, the limit of riots is they tend to orient themselves toward the state, toward the political. Often it's because, as I think we're all perfectly aware, in our current situation, the most familiar thing that sets off a riot is the death, often murder by the police, of a young person of color. Right? And that's the standard starting sequence for a riot in our age, for a major riot. And inevitably, those riots orient themselves toward the cops, toward the police station, toward the state in general. Now this has to be done to a certain extent. And I've had friends in Egypt who've had the pleasure of burning police stations, and one who got to go in and discover the police files have been kept on her since she was 12 years old. And that's the flip side of like some friend getting their car burned, right? Like we have to love the burning of that police station that has those records, because those records are going to be used to imprison, torture, and kill people. But the moment of looting is the moment where it turns away from the state, where it recognizes that it's the economy that has to be dealt with. It's not a solution. Looting is not a solution, kids. But it successfully identifies, it's that moment where it stops just being like a showdown with the cops, and identifies what the problem might be, which is the problem of the commodity, of access to it, of goods. Which is why you get these sort of desperate, pathetic media stories about like, oh, this poor person he wasn't looting high-protein, low-carb food like any serious writer with a real political commitment would. It's flat-screen television's that bastard. Which is this way to sort of downplay the way that that moment of looting registers the need for the free sharing of goods, not mediated by having to go to work and get money and so on, right? So in that moment, it's a moment of recognition, but that recognition has to move toward a different moment. And in the same sense, riots have their own limit, right? For me, what it means to transcend a riot is not the strike, but something like a commune, right? The structure of a commune is the structure of the self-reproduction of a community outside of capital. That's what a commune is by definition. And a riot wants to move in that direction. So this is the way it wants to formulate what that practice is figuring out ways for a community to reproduce itself outside of capital. And if a riot points that way, and I think they do, we have to be very sympathetic to it. Sir, I saw there's multiple hands now. Did you want to fight it out? I don't know.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah. I'll go through like a series of what I think are propositions that you have to some of your positions, and if I'm wrong at any point, just tell me to stop.
No, if they're better than mine, I'll be like, no.
But so, if crisis is sort of internal to capital itself, right, and necessary for capitalist transformation, and riots and strikes are essentially sort of superstructural manifestations of the crisis in capital.
And okay, go on.
That's okay. I thought that's sort of what this sort of parallel.
Keep going. I'll try and backfill if I can.
Okay. Well, the problem is it's necessary for the rest of the question. It starts to then that like riots and strikes then are not from this position are not riots and strikes a necessary and inevitable feature of capital and feature of capitalist transformation, which if that's the case, then it takes away some of their political agency, right? Yeah. How do strikes and riots produce a sort of society that is otherwise absent of capital relations? Well, if strikes and riots are structural manifestations of crisis and capital are necessary for capitalist transformation, and riots and strikes are then logically necessary for capitalist transformation, they become an element of capital themselves. If that's the case, then in order to theorize how a riot or strike could produce a society that's otherwise from capital, you actually have to move out of crisis theory and theorize it otherwise. Right? Crisis theory will tell you that, from this standpoint, from what I understand, crisis theory tells us that riots and strikes are a necessary component of capital, but not how riots and strikes can be productively mobilized to think society otherwise. Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
I'm wondering.
I wouldn't use the language of. Sorry, I'm wandering away from the microphone. I don't really use the language of base and superstructure, and I don't think riots or strikes are superstructural features. I reserve that for, if we're going to use the language of base and superstructure, I reserve that for things like cultural production and the structure of the law and religion and like the traditional sense of superstructure, although I'm not even sure I'd use that language. So, I mean, I think that's worth pausing over, but I take the force of your question, which is, if, as I'm claiming, there's a logic to the appearance of riots in a given situation of capital, then they must also be understood as constitutive of capital rather than some magic intervention from outside. And if that's true, how can something that's constitutive of capital be the element of its unmaking? And I think that's, is that a fair restatement?
This is a perfect restatement. But in the secondary part of that is, if humanities theories are going to theorize how those riots and strikes can be productive to mobilize the exodus from capital, they have to be moving on crisis theory.
I'll actually just not sure. Here's where I get in trouble with the humanities people in the room. I'm not sure what it means when you say move beyond crisis theory. That's like saying, like, listen, if we want to theorize how we're going to fly, we have to move beyond gravity. Gravity's a thing, right? Crisis theory is a theory, but it describes an actual characteristic, right? You can't simply, like, you can move beyond it all you want. That characteristic is still happening. The roof is still going to fall in no matter how much you deny gravity. So I'm not quite sure what it means just to say move beyond crisis theory, except insofar as that sort of privileges the endless production of new theory that says, I have a whole new description of everything. Well, great, that whole new description of everything has very little to do with gravity's persistence, to me. So I'm interested in categories that can account for and I use this word advisedly, the real forces in the world. I'm not very interested in moving beyond a description of those real forces. I'm interested in figuring out what you do in response to those real forces. And for me, crisis theory describes real forces. So this language of moving beyond, I think, is internal to humanities disciplines, which like to generate new quasi-solutions so that there can be new quasi-books that people can then proclaim loudly for 3 or 4 years as a new quasi-solution before that fades away and the next one comes along, and crisis keeps recurring the whole time. So I'm less persuaded by that part. But the question about whether riots and strikes are also part of the way capitalism proceeds, I think that's a very serious question. And I think we want to, I mean, the answer is, of course, yes. We could also say revolution is one of the ways that capitalism proceeds. There have been major revolutions that haven't undone capitalism. The Haitian Revolution, right, is an amazing revolution. It fails in the end, but it doesn't in any way undo capitalism, right? So it's certainly true that as far as I can tell, the things which could undo capitalism don't necessarily undo it. And figuring out then what pushes it toward being a fundamentally anti-systemic activity rather than a pro-systemic activity is the real question. I don't think there's an easy answer, but I certainly don't think the answer is, there was a huge riot in 1965 and we still have capitalism, so let's abandon that. My point is this: there's going to be riots. I promise you. There's going to be more. There's going to be a lot more. Riots will be the form that anti-capitalist struggle takes for a huge number of people on the planet. So I think we don't necessarily do well to say, like, well, you're just kidding yourselves. It's like going to work. But at the same time, I take the question seriously. The way capitalism renews itself is to destroy a bunch of shit so that it can, create a destruction, as Schumpeter says, so that it can sort of start from a refreshed base without that clog of accumulation, right? So it's absolutely one wants to take seriously the question of sometimes capitalism destroys shit so as to start over, and how can riots not be that? I agree. That's a question.
Yeah. So. I have a couple things to say about riots and questioning kind of this assumption that they're going to be the way that anti-capitalist resistance shows itself in the coming period. I mean, historically, riots have not always been in challenging the state in any way, but actually reinforcing it, reinforcing capitalism, racism, institutions that exist under capitalism, especially in the United States. So you have, in 1917, the same year as the October Revolution, you have a riot in East St. Louis that was the result of a racist white labor union that was pissed that black workers had been hired at lower wages, who had been excluded from the union, etc., in these factories. So they were driving through the neighborhood harassing African-American workers. An undercover white police officer was shot, and the whites descended on East St. Louis and burned it down in a riot. Right? So how is that, as a riot, doing anything to suggest that there's somehow a correlation between riots and this capitalist, socialist, communist transition? And then today in Greece, right, there are riots in immigrant neighborhoods that are being carried out by the fascist group Golden Dawn, right? And you have sort of retaliatory instances of violence where Golden Dawn members are being killed, maybe by their own members, maybe by anarchists, who knows, whatever. But this, to me, seems to point that there is still a need for organization, for actually debating ideas within these movements, because there's always a danger that if we just let these riots happen, because they will happen, it will not necessarily be a transition, but actually sort of a reversion back to periods or instances of fascism that we've seen historically that are quite dangerous to the kind of politics that we're trying to push.
Of course, the tradition you speak of fascist or racist or pro-state riots is far more extensive than that. The one that has most struck me in my lifetime is the Rostock riots in Germany, right? It's extremely anti-immigrant slaughter, really, and you've named a couple other examples. And again, I don't at all mean to discount these things, but here's a puzzle, right? No one ever says, well, not enough people. Very rarely does someone say, well, listen, the conservatives have voted for some very terrible people, so that's clearly not a way to change the world. Let's just stop voting. Like, Democrats never say that. Like, of course, people who engage in a certain strategy, whether it's the strategy of voting or the strategy of riots or whatever, some of them are bad. This doesn't seem like a compelling historical fact to me. This seems like a fairly obvious claim. And that doesn't mean the strategy itself is not one that might, in a given circumstance, become an effective one, right? Which is to say, some people really believe in voting. I don't, obviously. But some people really believe in voting, and they never say, well, the reason to not vote is that people have used votes to elect bad people before. And so why would we say that about riots? People have used riots for bad ends before. Why does that take the riot off the table as a kind of anti-capitalist struggle? It doesn't seem to me logically that in any way follows. I'm certainly not arguing that we should not debate ideas. What I'm arguing is that we should be very slow to imagine that the debating of ideas has regulative power, to think that there's a right way to struggle and we're going to tell it to people. That's not an idea I feel comfortable with or embrace. I just don't think we're in a situation. If there was a situation in which sort of a vanguard model worked, where people, intellectuals debated and developed the right ideas that could keep struggle on its course, that's not a transcendental, ahistorical idea. That's an idea that develops in a certain specific, concrete historical situation in which we do not find ourselves. Even if we all thought, yeah, the mode of the avant-garde, the vanguard, the intellectual body that shows the people the way was a great idea, even if we all thought that, that's not the situation we're in. The kind of organizational models that came down from vanguardism depend on certain structures of collective agricultural labor, as in the case of the Soviet Union, where collectivized agricultural labor brings a lot of people together in masses that can be organized, or in rising industrial labor in given countries. Those are always the conditions for that kind of debate. And we're absolutely not in that situation anymore. There simply is no labor mass that can be organized by a magical vanguard. So even if we believe in that, I'm really not making an argument about the right belief, the correct belief. I'm making an argument about the possible in a given material condition. And I just don't think we're in that situation. So I'm trying to figure out what struggle is going to look like and how we might want to think about it, and then how we might intervene in the way it's likely to unfold, rather than the way we think it should unfold. I'm not a should guy. Yeah?
I was wondering what your thoughts were on like mass riots, like the one in Sao Paulo, Brazil, that just happened, I believe, in the summer.
I'm familiar.
And mass nonviolent protests like the Occupy movement.
Like what?
Like the Occupy movement.
Yeah, it was less nonviolent than you think.
But what were your thoughts were on the differences between these two modes?
These are big questions. Yeah, I actually didn't mean to be flippant. I wasn't at Occupy New York much. My experience of the other Occupies I was at, mostly Occupy Oakland and a couple others, was they were not nonviolent at all. Much of the violence came from the police, but there was also violence in response. Some people certainly argued for a nonviolent position, and some people argued for a diversity of tactics, which is the language around it. They'll try different things at different times, right, which includes violence. The stories of nonviolence that get told are often quite perplexing. Some people will tell you a little bit after the fact, for example, that The Arab Spring was nonviolent. I thought it was amazing. Like, all these people gathered in Tahrir and demanded to follow the regime, and it just happened. It's like, do you not have fucking YouTube? There was like battles with tanks, and people getting crushed with rocks, and people getting shot. And it was happening from both sides. But the fantasy production of nonviolence is an incredibly powerful one. Right? The people need to produce that. It's like, oh yeah. And people will tell you this incredible story about like Gandhian nonviolence, which is A, not what happened, and B, he actually took, Gandhi told some quite interesting stories about when violence might be necessary and when it might not be necessary. He was also himself a slightly violent person, particularly to his wife. So I don't think this clear distinction between nonviolent struggles and violent uprisings works as effectively as we would hope. Now there clearly are moments in the last few years, the current cycle, right, of large-scale non-violent gathering. I would say the Puerto del Sol gathering in Madrid is probably the best example of that. A vast number of people, some say 1 million, I doubt that, but a huge number. Pretty non-violent. Washed away in an instant. The cops come along with high-powered water hoses, it's over. So actually I don't think that non-violence, although people are very fond of it, especially people who have something to lose, is a very persuasive regulatory or moral idea. It's not very tactically effective. And I think, again, if we're interested in something beyond our own sense of our own moral purity, nonviolence is probably not worth valuing too highly. And I take revolutionary struggle seriously, so I don't take nonviolence very seriously at all. Yeah.
So one thing that you talked about at the start of the talk, and you hit on it here too, is how do you get the people with something to lose involved, right? You mentioned the millers and the weavers and the metallurgy guys, right? These are the guys who were kind of upper middle class, right? They had something to lose. The agrarian class didn't get very far until they got involved. So how do you get the IT developer making $50K in Lincoln, Nebraska involved in...
Are you talking about someone in particular?
No, when at the same time, I work a lot in the schools, 40% of kids here in Lincoln are on food-reduced lunch. So that's not just the people with nothing to lose, that's people with something to lose are still at this level of poverty. So how do you get to the precipice of getting those folks involved?
Swiftly. Which is to say, the category of people with something to with little to lose is increasing quickly. I actually don't think. I mean, whatever. One of the things it means to be a materialist is, as much as it's against your own interest, because I'm clearly a member of the middle class, I have more cultural capital than real capital, but you all know the category of the academic. It's. I would like to believe that my class is a revolutionary class, but I try not to delude myself too much. It's like, one needs a certain amount to get through the weed of self-delusion, but one tries to have some appropriate counterbalance. What matters to me is not the question of like, how do you get the people who are still in the top 2% of global income, even if they're not doing amazingly by American standards, how do you get them involved, which is your question. I'm not sure you do, but I'm not sure it matters, because it turns out that that line of the people who are excluded is rising and rising and rising. There's more people now who do not have direct access to the wage on the face of the planet than there has ever been in the history of the world, and it's increasing quickly. So for me the question is what an organizational form looks like that involves them. Whether the people who are not excluded from the wage get involved, that's going to be numerically less important each year. So I'd love to see those people get involved, but I'm not sure that's the fundamental question of political strategy. The fundamental question of political strategy is, what would the involvement of the excluded look like? And this gets us back to this production circulation question, right? Those people who are excluded, the people living at the outskirts of Sao Paulo or Dhaka or any number of cities worldwide, right, they can't go on strike. The idea of a strike strategy is absurd when you think about global surplus population. So what does struggle look like for them? And obviously it doesn't look like the strike, which gets us back to my argument, right? That it's going to be some other mode than the strike, which mobilizes those people who are truly immiserated and gives them a political form in which to struggle. But if you figure out a way to mobilize the American middle class into bloody struggle, totally call my private number. Other questions? Yeah, hi.
Are there any decent theories of human flourishing and well-being in a non-capitalistic framework out there.
Who cares? There isn't one in capitalism. Seriously. The idea that capitalism has provided that for people strikes me as manifestly disproven. So at this point, the question of how hot the boiling water has to be before you jump, the answer is some temperature or another, but you don't have to believe it's nirvana you're jumping to. You just have to believe the water's too hot. And so I don't know if those theories are plausible to me, and this is just an indication of my limits as a thinker. I could not give a shit. The question of human flourishing, yes, I think one thing about it, which is that capitalism makes it impossible. So let's take care of that little problem, and then we can test out every possible theory, and 95% of them will suck, and maybe we'll hit on one that works. And that's much better odds than we have currently. Hi.
I was wondering, do you think that riots are not influenced by the global economic order and they can't be manipulated by global economic powers? Like, I'm thinking of like the intervention in Libya on behalf of NATO, which was, arguably, well not arguably, but definitely, incentivized by opening Libya's oil markets to the outside world, which had previously, been protected by protectionist policies of Libya.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it usefully lays out the terrain, which is to say, I don't think that we in this room are the only people who are thinking about the structure of riots as a fundamental political fact in the present situation. I think that there's probably people who we might not think well of, who are also puzzling over that question. And yes, absolutely, I think that different people might have different conceptions of what they'd like riots to achieve, and many of those goals are not the same goals. This gets back to Charles' question. I mean, many of those goals are not goals on which we would think favorably and fondly. Certainly the early history of Nazi Germany, right, in the mid-1930s, is entirely a history of produced riots, by the state, so as to secure a certain political power for the fascists. I'm not quite sure what that does to my argument. Again, it's like, yes, this force can be used for good or evil, okay, but it's the situation we're in. But yeah, absolutely, it's something to be aware of.
But are there any riots that can't be manipulated by global economic powers?
That can't be? I don't know. There are riots, I think, that haven't been, and there will be riots that aren't. The condition of possibility, I'm not sure I understand, but...
Well, I just mean, like, insofar as there's incentive for a global economic power to open up, like, a mode of production that they previously didn't have access to.
Yeah. Again, I think that's right, but I'm not sure what the consequences are really for that. Strikes can also be produced by great powers and have been historically. In fact, I think it's fair to say, I don't want to hate on unions nonstop, but I think it's fair to say that the strike is the main way that labor has been sutured back into capital for the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years, from the moment of radical strikes, the general strikes of the early 20th century into the 30s. Since then, the strike isn't an anti-systemic force. It's the way the workers get sutured back in a moment of dissatisfaction. So your question sort of is, well, couldn't riots do that too, or do some other productive work for capitalism? That seems possible, but I'm working with the given, not with the fact that things could go wrong. Yes, things could go, they will go wrong. I promise. But it seems to me that if we understand riots as the forms of collective action that begin in the sphere of circulation and struggle there against capital's desperate need to circulate more and more, that's what a strong anti-systemic struggle is going to look like. Will capital try to mobilize that same force for its own good? That's what I would do if I was them. So, sure, but okay, on we go. That's a problem.
If we have time maybe for one final question. I don't know if Mitch or Jesse.
My question's not good enough for a final one.
Both of you. I hate to have like some.
Both. We can,
yeah.
we can do both, and even after that, maybe we can continue the discussion. But officially at 7, we have to leave this room.
But let's do both questions.
Yeah.
So can you talk in greater detail how the economic crisis hooks up to the ecological crisis? Because it really seems like those are very difficult to disentangle, and yet I don't see much of that reflected in sort of the current talk or crisis theory writ large.
That's a terrible way to try and end a conversation.
There's one other question, guys.
I mean, I think we should seriously take that as a question of study. As you could guess, I'm a proponent of, adherent to, have a deep commitment to a model of Marxist political economy. And even I, with that incredible attachment, can admit that Marxist theory has done a pretty terrible job of theorizing ecological crisis. Some people have tried to do it. There's probably 2 or 3 significant efforts I've seen. I think they've all fallen a bit short. And I think that's a serious research project. For people who want to do research projects as opposed to going out in the street and fighting, I think figuring out what a seriously Marxist theory of ecological crisis would look like is a central, desperately needed project. I think someone should be doing it. I haven't theorized it. I just recognize that as something that Marxism's been not done a very good job of thinking about. I think this framework of production and circulation provides certain ways to start to think about this this problem. I think that it poses a certain distinction between sea and land. Right? Sea is the space of production. Land is the space of production, and sea is the space of circulation. Alan Sekula, the recently departed artist and theorist, has done the best work about this, including a documentary film called The Forgotten Spaces of Capital, which is about sort of shipping industry and so on. And so you think about something like indigenous struggle in Hawaii and ecological despoliation there, and the way that Hawaii was privatized in the 19th century, right? But capitalism arrives in Hawaii with the settlers, and the king of Hawaii, as a way of trying to protect Hawaii from this new privatization, divides up the island in this very specific, peculiar way as pie-wedged slices. So every segment has both a land component and a component that touches the ocean. This is actually an interesting, like, ecological model, right, of like what it means to conceptualize a biomass and what its relationship to the larger whole is going to be, built exactly against this question over production spaces and circulation spaces. So they go together, but that for me is an incredibly preliminary thought, and I want someone who's super smart about ecological crisis to work it through more. I must say, one thing that's utterly baffling, if anyone here works on sort of recent ecological thought, is this formulation of the Anthropocene. Has anyone heard that phrase, which is meant to describe the period in which human intervention has fundamentally changed the planet? So we live in an era in which human society has become a force that changes the base of our environmental situation. It's an analytical category. It's supposed to help us think. It turns out the Anthropocene begins in the 1780s, which is to say, it's not humans that changed the planet. It's the Industrial Revolution. It turns out the Anthropocene starts when we invent the steam engine. And so if one follows that line of the Anthropocene without recognizing it as a fundamental critique of the capitalist mode of production, one is, I forget what the technical term is, like a moron. And yet people want to do that. They pose the Anthropocene as some contrary to a reckoning with political economy, and that seems like a travesty to me. So thinking these things together is a vital project for people who want to think seriously about how to change the world, absolutely.
I'm concerned about the distinction between violent and peaceful rioting or protest. It isn't just the act of taking space, taking the space that was colonized, or I have your autumn of the system in front of me. You underscore the way in which time is colonized. It isn't the act of putting one's foot down and saying, I'm going to occupy this time or this space violently itself.
Yeah, thank you. That's not a question, really. It's a point, and it's right. Which is to say, when I was responding to that previous question, I think what I was grappling with was, maybe because I'm too close to it, like the ideology of nonviolence when encounters in movements. Sort of the peace police show up and say, don't do that, man, that's going to look bad on camera, and the media won't like us, and these sort of imaginings of managing sort of for the spectacle, what political action is going to look like. And I'm trying to gauge that as a serious problem. But at a theoretical or conceptual level, of course, you're completely right. It's always already violent, whether it's occupied land, thinking about struggles in Canada that are happening right now, with Adenauer is an obvious case. The violence is there already, and to refuse it is necessarily an engagement with that violence, whether or not one has started with the looting yet. And so I think that's, right, the fantasy that we can remove ourselves into a space of nonviolence as if we're not being violent right now, that is, yes, you're completely correct to point out, sheer delusion.
So you're not trying to draw some kind of threshold of damage that must be done or something?
That seems like a different question altogether. But must be done, should be done, again, that's not me. I can guess how this is going to unfold, and even by the most conventional measures, the riots are going to be very, very violent. But I'm not saying should or not should. I think that's a necessary feature of changing fundamental social relations. I don't think there's any history of it happening otherwise.
Okay, there's another necessary feature of every talk, which is the ending. So please.
That's violence right here.
The violence of the time.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming.
And again, we would appreciate if you can take a second to fill out the survey and just drop it off in the box here on the left side, like the entrance up there. That would be great. Thank you very much. See you in February.
That's right.
For this semester.